As Julie mentioned, I'm going to share my screen just really quickly, and give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Awesome. And let me enter full screen if I can. Okay, there we go. Is that a reasonable size? Folks can see the text?
It's actually smaller now.
It's a little bit smaller? Okay.
Yeah.
See if I can make it bigger.
That's better.
That's better. Okay. Well, so you can see a little bit of my messy desktop in the background, but that's okay. So this week is Parashat Shemot, and one of the ironies, I guess, of reading Parashat Shemot as American Jews in the 21st century, or in the 20th century, or at least as far back as we've had the Constitution and the election dates that we have, is that Parashat Shemot every year coincides more or less with a transition in our leadership. If we're in an election year, Parashat Shemot always coincides more or less with a transition in the election year. I remember in 2016, Parashat Shemot, in which we read about how a new king rose up over Egypt, occurred the exact same week as President Trump's inauguration. And this year, Parashat Shemot is a little bit earlier in our calendrical cycle, based on how the Hebrew calendar doesn't quite match up with the American calendar. But we also read Parashat Shemot during an extremely dramatic and, of course, unsettling, disturbing moment in our history of political transitions in this country. So I think it's not always that what happens in the parsha seems to speak so directly and literally to what's going on in the world, but sometimes it does happen. And Parashat Shemot is just one of those examples. Just 1 second, my 2-year-old is. I can't come with you, but I. Okay. Sorry, folks. This is part of what it's like when everyone is working from home. So the first thing I wanted to, this is my son Gabriel. So the first thing I wanted to do is simply read verses 8 through 11 in Parashat Shemot, which introduces the new Pharaoh. So, and as I'm reading, there's two things that I want you to be thinking about. The first thing is are there things about the text that are unclear? So what are some questions that you have about the text, and we'll try to take a few of those. And are there things that surprise you in the text, or that you feel like call out, even if they're not unclear, things that you feel like call out for some more explanation? So, Vayako melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. So a new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And just putting us into context, remember the thing that happened at the end of Breshit is that we had the whole dramatic Joseph narrative where Joseph is sold into slavery with his brothers, by his brothers, and eventually all of them, when there's a famine, Joseph rises to prominence in Egypt, and there's a famine, and Joseph helps the Egyptians have enough food. So his brothers ultimately end up coming down to Egypt to find food, and lo and behold, there's brother Joe, and that inaugurates all of Jacob's household going down into Egypt, where, as we know, this parsha, they're going to become slaves. They're going to become a prominent family and a prominent tribe in Egypt, and then they're going to be ultimately enslaved by this Melech Hadash, by this new king. So that's where we are, sort of in the narrative arc of the Jewish people. So, and he said to his nation, "Look, the nation of the children of Israel has grown too large for us. Come, let us be shrewd with them. Hava nitchakma lo," which is sort of an interesting expression. Come, let us be shrewd with them. Chochma, from the same word which means wisdom. Let us act with cunning, or let us act with wisdom, lest they become too numerous for us. And then when war comes, we'll join our enemies and fight against us, rising up from the ground. And they placed tax collectors over them, sarei masim. Exactly what that means is a little bit unclear. Rashi, the great medieval commentator who we're going to look at in a little bit, says that those are tax collectors. And they build guarded cities for Pharaoh, Pitom, and Ramses. So they basically started building the pyramids, let's say. So I guess my first question, and I'd like to open it up for a few comments or a few questions, is, so what about this either surprises you or do you want to know more about? And the easiest way to do this is probably just to use the hand raise button, or you could raise your hand physically, and hopefully I'll see you, and we can unmute you that way. So something surprising or something that you want to know more about. Yes, 564. You're not a number, but I see 568 465. So I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, so the questions I have is, why was he suspicious that they would rise with his enemies?
Okay.
That's the first question. The second question is, well, more of amusing than a question. Is it because they were separate? They kept themselves separate. They kept the laws. They certainly didn't worship any of their gods, which made them very suspect.
Right. So two really good points. One thing that, in terms of keeping themselves separate, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, whether or not that is what specifically engenders Pharaoh's suspicion is not explicitly clear in the text, but I think it is implicit. And we know from the text that the Israelites actually settle in a particular area of Egypt. They settle in the area of Goshen, which was apparently very good for shepherding sheep, which the Israelites famously are. The Tanakh always imagines, so the paragon of the Israelite is a shepherd, Moshe's a shepherd, Yaakov's a shepherd, Yosef and his brothers are shepherds, and so on and so forth. And shepherding is actually, at least according to the Tanakh, sort of a lowly profession from the perspective, or a somewhat foreign profession from the perspective of the Egyptians. So they are definitely, physically are separate. And then And then the question of, right, why is Pharaoh suspicious? Because the Torah doesn't tell us anything about why Pharaoh's suspicious, right? Ostensibly, Pharaoh's suspicious for no reason. Or at least the Torah asks us for an answer. Yeah, David, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay, so I have a question. You talked about taxpayers that Rashi talked about, and this is not the first time, I think it happened in Maccabees also, that the Torah mentions taxpayers, and that seems to be one of the first strategies that dictators use to start oppressing a people. I mean, the Germans did it to the Jews in the Holocaust. The Maccabees, Turkey did it to the Maccabees. Pharaoh is doing it to the Jews, and it might not be a physical tax. It wasn't a financial tax. This was a physical tax, but it seems that seems to be a strategy. Do you agree with Rashi about that, or do you not?
So mas is, yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair enough interpretation of the Hebrew is vayasimu alav sarei masim. I think sarei masim certainly can mean tax collectors. I believe there's other suggestions that it can mean simply sort of oppressors or taskmasters or people who are sort of really on them all the time. But yeah, I think tax collectors is a perfectly reasonable one, and we'll see that some of the commentaries, as you mentioned. So one of the things that we're going to look at, in the next 15 minutes is that, David, you mentioned that dictators and oppressive regimes throughout history have sort of started off by levying taxes and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's so remarkable, I think, about this particular passage is precisely that, and precisely what we're going to see some of the later commentators highlight about this passage are things that we see every day authoritarian leaders trying to do. There's a statement in Ecclesiastes, ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. And really, in this case, it's one of those cases where what I think is sort of interesting about it and ironic about it, reading it in the moment in American history and the American calendar in which we read it, is that it is so similar. There are so many parallels between what we see in this text and what we see in the world. So yeah, tax collectors, absolutely. I think that's a great point, David. Any other thoughts about this? Or questions or things that are not clear? Jay. Yeah, Jay, we'll take one more.
Well, the thing that always bothers me when I read this text is the idea that Joseph is forgotten by the Pharaoh.
Right.
And I've done some reading and I've seen some midrash and some ideas that have came up that maybe it wasn't that Joseph was forgotten, but was it that that there was a new king new Pharaoh who actually was Egyptian, whereas Joseph was not an Egyptian born.
Right. Yeah, so it's a good point, Jay. And Joseph being forgotten is something which I didn't scroll down yet, but if any of you downloaded the source sheet, you'll see that is one of the things that we're actually going to look at. Was Joseph, in fact, forgotten? Because ostensibly it's peculiar, right? It would be analogous, let's say, to saying, depending on what your time horizons or how you understand the time horizons, it's been about, let's say, 400 something years since Joseph was the vice president of Egypt. So it's like, or maybe even more important. I think the way the Tanakh presents Joseph, it's more. I'm not sure that all of us can rattle off all of the vice presidents throughout American history, but I think Joseph. So I don't know who Thomas Jefferson's vice president is. Some of you probably do. Does anyone know? Anyone know? Sue, is that a hand? Jay, you know who Thomas Jefferson's vice president was? Who was it? Was it John Adams?
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr. Great. Very good. Right? So it would be akin to saying, let's say, gosh, nobody had any idea who Aaron Burr was in America, or nobody had any idea who Andrew Jackson was, or George Washington was, right? Joseph is described as a really major figure in Egyptian history, at least according to the Tanakh, and we're reading Tanakh, so that's what we care about in this context. So it's peculiar, right, to say that Joseph was forgotten, and some of the commentators pick up on that. So let's look at a few more texts, and then we can we'll just do one more, and then we'll look at a few more texts. Go ahead, Sue.
All
Just
right.
because you're in my field of vision.
Basically, these cities, they built the guarded cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. Who were they protecting them from? The Israelites or the enemies that were going to attack them?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, so right, it's sort of like if the fear. Right, if Pharaoh's fear is actually that the Israelites are going to rise up from the ground against them, then it's a little bit ironic that he's asking the Israelites to build, the fortifications against the Israelites, which is an interesting, yeah, I mean, I think that is an aspect, I suppose, of what's going on in the text. The Israelites are in some sense the Israelites are in some sense participating in the instruments of their own oppression, maybe, let's say. It seems he's not only concerned about the Israelites, because he mentions Israel. So Egypt is a temporal power in the ancient, is sort of an empire in the ancient Near East, right? So they have regional enemies that they might be concerned about. That's an interesting point. Okay, so let's look at a few texts. We're going to scroll down a little bit. The first text is a text from Rabbi Aaron Abu al-Rabi, who's probably the least well-known of the three commentators that we're going to look at. We're also going to look at Ramban, Nachmanides from 13th century Spain, and then, of course, Rashi from 11th century France. Rabbi Aaron Abu al-Rabi was a 15th century Sicilian rabbi. He is mostly a commentator and a philosopher and an astrologer. And he has sort of an interesting career. He is very involved throughout his life in sort of religious geopolitics, to the extent that existed in the ancient world. In the medieval world, he traveled around quite a bit and was very involved from Israel to Turkey to Spain to Italy, of course. And he was quite involved in disputations. He was theological disputations, which is a form of discourse that has sadly, I think, gone a little bit out of style, because I think theological disputation can be very interesting and very productive. But it was a common thing in the medieval world was a Jewish and a Christian scholar would get together in some kind of public forum to debate aspects of theology or interpretation. And Aaron Abu Arabi was very involved with this throughout his life, including having rather warm relationships with Pope Martin, who was the Pope at the time, who was, I guess, favorably disposed towards the Jews. So he knew a lot of people important people in the religious world in medieval Europe, and he was involved in a lot of conversation with them. And he says so on the verse, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav atzu mimenu. Behold, remember Pharaoh says, behold, the people of Israel are going to become too numerous for us. He says flatly, this is not possible. Ze lo yitachen. It's not possible. Which is, I don't know if anyone mentioned this particular thing, but this always jumps out to me actually when I read this text, which is that this is not a plausible claim, right? Even if Joseph and his family came down to Egypt with 64? The Torah tells us exactly, and I think it's 63 or 64 souls. There's no chance, right? Even if they're extremely fertile, which the Tanakh imagines that they are, like, there's no chance that in a couple of generations the Israelites are going to be more numerous than the Egyptians, or so numerous that actually their sheer physical numbers are going to provide a threat. It's an implausible claim. And so he says, rather, Ella amar kain lachnis sina belev amo la'asot ritzono. Rather, he said this in order to insert hatred in the heart of his people or his nation, la'asot ritzono, in order that they would do his will. So the first, and it's really, sometimes when rabbis or anybody is reading the Torah and trying to make connections to the modern day, you're trying to find something to sort of hang a contemporary idea or a contemporary resonance on, and you're trying to make a bit of a jump between what the text is saying and how we want to understand the text in our lives. In this case, though, it's not at all anachronistic, I don't think, to say that the first thing Pharaoh does when he wants to oppress the people is he starts off with some propaganda or some fake news, right? He says, right? Because it's not a plausible claim, and most careful readers of the Tanakh who knew the context of the story would know that it's not a plausible claim. And Al-Rabi is saying, no, we're meant to understand from this that the first step on the road towards oppressing people is in fact to lie to them and tell them things that aren't true, right? To propagandize. And we see this over and over in history, right? We see this, of course, in Nazi Germany. Someone mentioned, David, I think, mentioned that. We see this everywhere. We see this in Russia, and we see this in America, right? It's the first step. Any thoughts or reactions to that before we look at a few more texts? We have 7 or 8 more minutes. Rabbi Zev Chaim Feyer.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
I'm looking at the new king did not know Joseph, knowing as a biblical euphemism for intimacy.
Uh-huh.
And Joseph etymologically being increase or addition. The new king had no concept of the benefits of increase, and therefore saw the increase among the Israelites as dangerous.
Uh-huh. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, lo yada. I mean, yeah, no, I think that's a very nice point. And yada, as the rabbi, astutely and importantly mentions, always yada, that root in biblical Hebrew, as in Adam knew his wife, right? Right. Knowing in the biblical sense, it often has it often has a sexual connotation, but it always has an experiential connotation. In other words, knowing is not something that happens only in the mind. Knowing is something that happens in an experiential way in the Bible. Which whenever you're reading the Tanakh, it's important to keep that in mind, right? So this Pharaoh, maybe he doesn't. So maybe he does know Joseph, right? Maybe he knows that there was this figure named Joseph, but he doesn't know anything about him, or he hasn't experienced anything about him and his family, and so he perceives it as a threat. I think that's a very nice point. So let's look now at let's look at two short comments from Rashi, and then we'll look at a longer comment from Ramban, if we have time. So Rashi, among the most important, or the most important medieval commentator on the Tanakh, he lives in 11th century France. He was not involved in geopolitics. He was sort of living in the countryside. He was a wine merchant and was relatively unknown. Not in the Jewish world, he was relatively known, but sort of in the wider world, unlike a figure like Al-Rabi, he was not as worldly. And he quotes two things about this Vayakom Melech Hadash. First, he quotes a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel, two sages in the Talmud, and he said one said that it was truly a new king, and one said that it was the same king, Shenidchadshu Gzeirotav, who basically changed his policies. Which I think the thing that motivates this comment is something I've alluded to, and we've alluded to a few times, which is that a lot about how the Tanakh presents what the Pharaoh is doing seems implausible, right? It's not plausible that there's all of these Jews. It's not plausible, probably, I don't think, that the Pharaoh wouldn't have known anything about Joseph, right? And so there's at least one opinion that it's in fact the same Pharaoh who has basically just changed his tune. And then in the second half of the verse, Rashi says explicitly, Asher lo yada. And he says, Asatzmo ki'ilu lo yada. He pretended that he didn't know Joseph. Again, because I think it's not on its face plausible that the Pharaoh's completely unaware. And the tradition is alive to that. Any thoughts? And then we'll look at maybe one more source. Yeah, Tanya. You got to unmute, Tanya.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, this may be repeating what's already been said, but I taught this parasha earlier this week, and one of the things that came up, he just absolutely refused to acknowledge him.
We'll say that again?
He refused to acknowledge him because the Pharaoh refused to acknowledge Joseph.
Refused to acknowledge, as opposed to not knowing, you mean? Is that what you're getting at?
He refused to acknowledge his contributions because if you think about it, and I hate to go back to Nazi Germany, but I'm seeing the same scenario over and over again. You know, a lot of the Jewish people were dismissed from their positions as civil servants. Their art, their music was like totally banned. Their books were thrown in the fire. It was classified as degenerate. And so I really kind of think it's something like this. He just refused to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible. And it's in a sort of another way of looking at similar aspects of what we see going on in the Tanakh and in the world and throughout history. Again, I think something with this parsha is so it really confers like nothing ever. It's disquieting and a little bit discouraging in a way, because it's like it was happening then and it's happening now, and what can we do to sort of change the script and change the narrative? Robert, I saw you had something. Robert, you still have something? We'll hold, if you do, we'll look at the last text, and then we'll have time for one or two more comments, and I'll wish you guys all a Shabbat Shalom. So the last text.
Oh, I got it.
Oh, you got it. Okay,
Rabbi,
go ahead.
Rabbi, I just want to underline what sticks with me is the dramatic role that Joseph played in indenturing the Egyptian people to the Pharaoh. In the light of that, for the Pharaoh not to recognize Joseph's contribution is not credible to me.
Yeah, no, I agree, right? And what Robert's referring to is that earlier on in the Joseph narrative, Joseph basically gathers all of this food in order to dole it out during the 7 years of famine, and in order to receive the food, the Egyptians basically have to become serfs. They sell portions of their holdings to the crown, and Joseph basically transforms all of Egypt into, Pharaoh's serfs, basically, which, right, it's implausible that the crown would then forget that had happened, I think. It's also another sort of wrinkle and complication in this is it's not clear that all of the Egyptians would be so favorably disposed towards Joseph after that. I mean, if there was this, it's not to say that the Israelites are at all complicit or responsible for their own enslavement. No. Lahavdil. But, if a foreign leader comes in and then basically at the end of his time in power, suddenly all of the people who live there have literally been sort of made indentured servants to the crown, that's not necessarily going to engender the fondest feeling, which is, of course, a feature of Joseph's life in general. Joseph is not always, or seldom maybe, engendering particularly warm feelings in at least his brothers. All right, so one last comment, and then we'll close it out because we're already 1 minute over. So this is from Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who is a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist and philosopher and a very important commentator. And he sort of recapitulates a lot of what we have been saying, and for me, it sort of really clarifies the propaganda aspect of all this. So Pharaoh and his ministers could not simply slaughter them by the sword, for it would be truly egregious to slaughter for no reason a nation that originally came to the land at the behest of the former king. So the first thing he notices is that if you take a historical arc, Pharaoh's not going to be able to do, whether it's a new Pharaoh, it's the same Pharaoh, Pharaoh's not going to be able to do what Pharaoh wants to do based on the arc of history. Because, of course, yes, these people came legally, let's say, that's a little bit anachronistic, but they came at the behest of the king, and and Joseph helped the nation, so you can't just do away with them outright. And also, the Egyptian citizens wouldn't allow their king to enact such violence, for he consults with them. And I think this is sort of a charming, I don't know if this is historically true, but I think it's charming that Ramban actually thinks that leaders or pharaohs, they can't just do whatever they want. Citizens won't tolerate it, right? They're gonna stand up and say, it's wrong, right? And this is so even regarding a large and mighty nation such as Israel, who might indeed wage war on them. And he says, even if he entertains the possibility that the Jews are large enough and mighty enough to pose a threat, and he said, even if that's the case, the Egyptian citizens are not going to allow them simply to be enslaved or slaughtered because it's wrong. And it's wrong. It's a remarkable level of moral uprightness and civic engagement that he imagines the ancient Egyptians have, which I think is sort of an interesting part of this comment as well. So instead, he suggests acting shrewdly in order that the Israelites should not feel the hostile intent. So he imposes a tax on them, because it is the normal way of things for immigrants to be taxed. So to bring us back to, I think, David's comment at the beginning, which is that you are sort of ratcheting up the pressure slowly. First, you are saying, gosh, those people down in Goshen, what's going on with those people? There's too many of them. First, you start with some propaganda, a little bit of fake news. And then you levy some tax. You say, well, you know what? Let's tax them a little bit. Let's lean on them a little bit. And you slowly habituate both your citizens and the people who you're oppressing to this new regime, to this new normal, to this new way things are, so that by the time suddenly they are enslaved building the pyramids, it seems like it has always been this way, when it had not. And I'll just close. I don't think it. I think we've said it throughout the day. I think this is just an incredibly urgent and timely kind of message. And I think one thing the Torah wants from us always is to be reading these stories and to take them out into the world. And I think these are very real and pressing dangers. Obviously, we saw them in our country this week. We've been seeing them in our country, certainly, I think, for the past 4 years, and we've been seeing them longer in our country. Fake news and propaganda were not invented in January of 2016. They were not. They have a long history before that, and it's the job of all of us to be on guard against that. So thank you so much for learning with me a little bit this morning. Thank you for the comments. Julie, do you have anything else before we say Shabbat Shalom?